Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Thursday, November 13th, day 769 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda. Good to be with you again.
It is such a pleasure, and it has been a minute. So we are going to talk about how U.S. President Donald Trump has asked Israeli President Isaac Herzog to pardon Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in a letter. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is condemning extremist Israeli settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. Syria's leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, was in Washington this week, and he said that Trump backs his stance on the Golan Heights. We'll also discuss the new addition to the Abraham Accords and promises made and broken regarding the Palestinian Authority's pay-to-slay program. All of this and more when we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. President Isaac Herzog yesterday announced that U.S. President Donald Trump had written him to ask him to pardon Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is currently standing trial on charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. Check out this week's What Matters Now with Chaviv Ratigur for his compelling reason for why a pardon could be a good idea. But Jacob, what essentially were the contents of this Free Bibi letter?
It's a good way to put it. I would say it started with full-on praise of Netanyahu for his cooperation with President Trump on Iran and calling him this wartime prime minister. And it just made me think about how things have shifted in the relationship between these two. It seems like over are the days where President Trump is cursing at Netanyahu or telling him to pull back those planes from striking Iran, or getting angry at Netanyahu for calling President Biden to wish him congratulations on his election win, and claiming that Netanyahu is not someone who wants peace. Those are all things that I guess are not so relevant anymore to their relationship. So times are really good. And now this is kind of the climax of not only is he supporting Netanyahu and everything he does, but he's also trying to get involved on this trial. And if you recall, this is not the first time Trump has weighed in on this issue. He's done it a couple times on social media. And then I think it was on 60 Minutes a week or two ago where he said he would be getting involved further without getting into details.
But wait, Jacob, of course, the most memorable moment, at least for Israelis, is in the Israeli Knesset on, I believe it was October 13th, when Trump was here in his whirlwind trip. When in the Knesset, he had this off-the-cuff remark, hey, why don't you just free this guy or something of that nature? So please continue.
Thank you very much for pointing that out. Somehow I forgot all that in the going back further in time. But yes, that seemed to be the peak. And then we have this official letter because I think Trump was deciding how he was going to weigh in when he decided he wanted to do so. And what I understand, speaking to a U.S. official about this, is that there had been contacts between Netanyahu's aides and Trump's aides over the past few weeks, particularly on this issue. It's obviously some contact's been going back longer, as Netanyahu's aides have tried to, and Netanyahu himself have tried to tell Trump, look, we're in the same situation. You've had your fake news legal battles, and I've also had to deal with the deep state that's going after me. And I think that's something that has played to Trump very well. And I think that's why he decided to weigh in on this. I did ask this U.S. official whether there's this broader quid pro quo in which Netanyahu basically is given this help on this pardon. And in exchange, he's willing to be a little bit more flexible on the implementation of the ceasefire in Gaza, or on making concessions regarding the Palestinians in order to get a Saudi Arabia normalization deal. But what the U.S. official said is no, there's no quid pro quo. This is something Trump just believes in, and decided to weigh in pretty strongly with this letter. And he's saying that now that I've done all these things with Israel and with Netanyahu on Iran and in Gaza, now it's time to let Bibi unite Israel by pardoning him. There's a bit of a question I would wonder is whether or not pardoning Bibi will allow for unity in Israel. I guess on the one hand, I think there are still people who would probably feel the same way about Netanyahu that they did before pardon. On the other, I think this is as what Chaviv talks about a little bit in that episode with you, is that this is really causing a lot of damage in Israel, and maybe allowing a pardon will allow people to move on a little bit. So perhaps that's what Trump is thinking about when pushing for this.
Well, Trump wasn't the only U.S. official weighing in yesterday, and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio yesterday said that there is, quote, some concern about events in the West Bank undermining efforts to maintain the ceasefire in Gaza. These were his first remarks on the latest spate of settler violence, and this week dozens of Israelis launched a large-scale arson attack on Palestinians in the West Bank, targeting factories and farmland between the major cities of Nablus and Tulkarem. Unfortunately, there are always incidents of violence in some parts of the Palestinian areas of the West Bank during the olive harvest. So, Jacob, you were in a previous life our settler correspondent, and I wonder, is it markedly higher this year than in years past?
According to statistics that have even been released by the IDF, it has been higher in general since October 7th. I think instances of settler violence had become relatively frequent even before so, but it's been almost a near daily occurrence in the past 2 years. And this olive harvest was much worse than the previous one, according to data. Just in terms of Rubio, I think it was interesting that he did weigh on this because the U.S. is, at least under the Trump administration, has not been very eager to talk about this issue. I will note that Rubio was asked specifically about whether or not this would lead to undermining the ceasefire, and he basically said, well, I hope it won't. I don't think it will, but there's always some concern that it could. So I wouldn't say it was the most clear-cut or forceful condemnation, and even he made a point of praising Isaac Herzog, the president, and the IDF for issuing condemnations, something that Netanyahu and members of the coalition have never done for the most part on these issues, and remain mum on this issue, continuing, including today. But even when praising the IDF's response, the IDF was able to detain 4. They were transferred to the police, and the police released 3 of those 4. There's only 1 left in custody, and which is kind of a similar song and dance that we see a lot of times where even if there are arrests, convictions are far, far less likely.
Just to clarify what you're saying, when they're detaining 4, you're talking about detaining 4 extremist settlers, not Palestinians, because what often happens, at least what we're seeing, is that the IDF comes out and then they'll detain Palestinians, and often in some very humiliating circumstances. So the fact, yes, that 4 Israeli Jewish extremist settlers were detained is sadly actually noteworthy, right, Jacob?
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out as well. So we'll see if this last person is kept or charged or anything. I think there's this bit of a power battle going on blame battle between the IDF and the security forces, the Shin Bet, who argue that it should be on the police to try to convict in these cases. And then the police turns around and says, no, it's more the IDF. And in the meantime, nobody seems to be really getting any sort of prosecution, and these attacks are happening with impunity. It's noteworthy also that the Trump administration's weighing in on this. Do they think maybe now that they're going to rethink their decision to wipe away those sanctions that the Biden administration put in place last year? That was something that Trump scrubbed on the first day, so I don't think so. But I do think, from speaking with one U.S. official, that maybe now we're going to start seeing this issue actually raised by the U.S. in some of the meetings it holds with Israeli officials.
Okay, we are going to go to a short break and then come back with some exclusive reporting from Jacob. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. So this week, France hosted Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas in Paris for a meeting during which French President Emmanuel Macron committed his country to helping the PA draft a constitution for a future state. We are obviously going to follow up and see if it will be based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. But Jacob, let's turn and concentrate on some exclusive reporting that you brought us a day earlier when Abbas fired his finance minister for allowing payments to Palestinian security prisoners through an old mechanism which we usually call pay to slay. And this mechanism awarded them or their families monthly salaries based essentially on the length of their sentences, which is loosely corresponding to the severity of their crime. So, Jacob, you've been tracking these sanctions that were placed that you mentioned with the Biden administration, but also not only. And basically, the U.S. has been trying to get the PA on track and to stop these payments. And it had appeared on the surface that the PA had stopped the pay to slave salaries. So how did you discover this new wrinkle that they're not, essentially?
So yeah, I've been following this for quite a bit of time, and we did publish, I think it was in September, me and Nurit Yochanan, our Palestinian Affairs correspondent, that actually that there was a new mechanism that was put in place, old newish entity that was repurposed for this new social welfare program where people would be paid strictly based off of their socioeconomic status. And there were a long list of criteria that were put in place. And we even saw messages sent out to several thousand people notifying them that they were no longer going to be qualifying for welfare under this new system. And there were also a couple thousand who were notified that they were newly able to get these payments. So there were a lot of things that were in place since President Abbas made this announcement in February. However, what we hadn't really been seeing was the actual payments for quite some time. And this was because Israel's been withholding hundreds of millions of dollars in Palestinian tax revenues that it's supposed to be transferring each month. It's been protesting the steps that the PA has been taking on in international arenas against Israel. And as a result, the PA hasn't had the funds to even pay welfare stipends to people. But finally, over the past month or so, they've been able to scrap up some funds, and they were preparing to, I guess, carry out these first round of payments, but felt that simply there were certain parts of the new program were not fully in place. So they notified some of the stakeholders who have been involved in this that they were going to be doing one payment cycle partially through the old system. Most of the payments would be through the new, but some would be through the old. This wasn't something that the various stakeholders wanted to hear, be it the US or Saudi Arabia or France, which are the three main countries have been pushing this, along with others. But what they were assured is that there would not be any new prisoners receiving any of these payments, meaning that this is only for those who used to be receiving the stipends. But what ended up happening is that the Prisoners Club, which is this organization within the Palestinian Authority that supports the prisoners and their families, they would actually adding names to the list of new prisoners to the finance ministry that was sending out these funds and didn't notify the finance minister. But the finance minister signed off on these payments. And therefore, I guess once there was an internal probe that was conducted because some people got wind of it. Once the internal probe found out that these payments were made to new prisoners, that's what set off a lot of alarm bells in these stakeholders' countries. And they notified Abu Mazen, President Abbas. And I think, from my understanding, he didn't know about these payments. It doesn't seem likely that only the finance minister did, but that was the head that was decided to roll as a result of this probe. And as the announcement was made on Monday that he was fired, I looked into it a little bit more and found out all these details about why really he was fired, because there was no announcement or there was no explanation for why he was being replaced with someone else in the cabinet. So I think that for now this is satisfied. It seems to be the stakeholders involved, but a big question is going to be whether or not the next round of payments are made fully properly and not just some of them, which is what happened this time. I think one PA official I spoke with said this proves that Abu Mazen is serious about the reform. He's making sure people are held accountable for this violation. On the other, I think it also shows that there is under a ton of pressure from prisoners' families who make up a very large number of people in the West Bank and also in Gaza. I mean, and it includes several thousand people who are in administrative detention. So they're not being held on charges, and they can be held for very long amounts of time, and that's something that's very controversial. And I think as a result, there's more support for the families as a result of these difficult conditions. And I think we'll have to see whether this pressure is something that Abu Mazen can sustain. There will likely be protests against him. But he has a time, it looks like another month that he's bought of time with the international community that's willing to see if he's able to follow through.
Now, this pay to slay program is not just another program in the Palestinian Authority. It's definitely one of the red flags that many Israeli politicians raise often when they're talking about the Palestinian Authority and how corrupt and terrible it is for Israel. And since your first reporting, when we had thought that the program had stopped. There were politicians who continued to raise this red flag, and we were always kind of confused and a little like, well, didn't you get the memo? They stopped this program. And so I just wonder whether Israel knows or knew, or these politicians specifically knew, that it was indeed continuing and were continuing to raise this pay to slay terrible, terrible flag.
So I have to believe that some in the Israeli security establishment are able to know what the answer to that question is, because I think they have a lot of ways to track Palestinian finances, and there's a lot of cooperation between the two systems as a result of that. But when I would speak to the foreign ministry, because Gideon Sa'ar, for example, the foreign minister, has been one of those people, as you mentioned, that's been constantly saying that the system is still in place. When I'd ask him about it, they gave me examples that didn't prove anything that they were trying to argue. They were pointing to the fact that the payments were being made through the postal office system in the West Bank, but that in and of itself doesn't prove that the payments were therefore under the old system, just because that was the way that they were getting them before. I think there's still discussions over how the new payments will be made. Will it be made through also, again, the post office system, or will it be a new one? That's one of the final things they need to figure out, I guess, at least for some of the payments. That was something I noticed, was the rhetoric that you were hearing from Israeli officials wasn't being backed up. So I was looking for, I think, a little bit of evidence like I was able to find in this case, because obviously we're looking to report objectively. If we first saw evidence to show that it was in place and we reported about that, now we found evidence that it was not. And that's what led to the firing. I think the PA is in a real difficult position right now, because I think Abu Mazen had been repeatedly talking about this as something that we were in the process of doing, had already done, and now that finds out, but when in a moment in time where they really need international support, the Saudis particularly, who are very on edge about funding them with hundreds of millions of dollars. I think if this doesn't get done, I think they're not gonna have a real strong case to make about being involved in the post-war management of Gaza. Obviously, there are more important reforms that they need to conduct as far as Palestinians are concerned. Most importantly, the elections that haven't been held in quite some time. But I think for the U.S. and other international community, this is something they want to see first. And if Abbas can't do this, I think he's going to have a hard time moving forward with these countries.
And not to be ageist, but just remind our listeners, how old is Abbas right now?
89 going on 90.
Okay. May he continue. All right. So Syria's leader, Ahmed al-Shara, on Monday said that U.S. President Donald Trump supports Syria's insistence on a complete Israeli withdrawal from Syrian territory as a condition for a comprehensive security deal between the long-warring neighboring countries. We've discussed several times on the podcast how extremely strategic these areas are in terms of Israel's security. So before we dive into the content, tell me about the reception of al-Shara in the States. I mean, this is, just to remind our listeners, a former terrorist who is now the leader of Syria.
Yeah, it was quite remarkable. And I think who's ever doing PR for Syria is doing some very fine work. There are a couple of very noteworthy videos that came out from this visit. One was with Ahmed Ashar, who's well over 6 feet tall, playing basketball with the head of CENTCOM. That was one of his first days of the trip, and they got him shooting a basketball. Not horrible for him, but definitely a presence on the court with that kind of stature. So that was one great video. And the second one came out on Wednesday after the visit with President Trump in the Oval Office. You have President Trump gifting Ahmed Ashara some cologne, and he sprays him a couple times, once on each side of the shoulder. And he also gives the foreign minister, Shabani, a couple sprays as well. Not something that you're used to seeing. Of course, Trump wants to use the opportunity to sell his cologne. This one he was giving for free. But during the conversation about the cologne, he's like, you can give this to your wife or multiple wives if you happen to have more than one, which is basically what he said, which is quite, I guess people are okay with the jokes when they're coming from Trump. They don't take it too seriously. It seemed like Ahmed Ashara took it well as well, but not something that I think some people would be too thrilled to be asked.
So it sounds like Trump was lifting the whiff of terrorism as well. And in this interview that al-Shara gave to, I think it was the Washington Post, it really sounded as though the Syrian leader believes that Israel will willingly leave the Golan Heights area, including the top of the Hermon, which is, again, so extremely strategically important for Israel. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think what was noteworthy is he differentiated between the Golan Heights that Israel has annexed for decades.
Which the U.S. recognized under the previous Trump administration, I point out.
Thank you. And differentiate between that and the lands that Israel took over on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights after the fall of the Assad regime last year. So that's a split that he tries to make. And the argument he uses, it seems to be he makes it kind of jokingly, but he argues that Israel occupies in his mind the Israeli side of the Golan Heights, and that was in order to protect the north of Israel. And now it's occupied the other side of the Golan Heights, and that is to protect the Israeli side of the Golan Heights. What's next? Is Israel going to occupy central Syria in order to protect southern Syria? So that's the argument he makes. At the same time, he still says we're in direct talks with Israel. We're open to having a security agreement. As you mentioned earlier, Abraham Accords, full normalization, that might take some more time. But we haven't been responding to the over 1,000 strikes, that's his number, that the IDF has conducted in Syria because we're focused on rebuilding Syria and we're happy to be at peace with all of our neighbors. But I do think it was noteworthy that he says that Trump is someone who supports the Syrian position regarding an Israeli withdrawal, at least for starters, from the Syrian side of the Golan Heights.
And was there a U.S. administration, a Trump administration statement corresponding to what the Syrian leader said, or are we just not hearing anything yet?
No, conveniently not. And this is not something that the Trump administration, I would imagine, would say publicly at this stage. I will say months and months ago when I spoke to U.S. officials about this, that this was something that they would like to see at some point. Israel, for its part, has also said it's not permanent, their presence there. But I think Israel Katz might have gone a little bit further on this. But the idea is that it's indefinite until they feel that the security situation improves.
Okay, so let's turn to the newest member of the Abraham Accords. And U.S. President Donald Trump announced on Thursday, a week ago, that the Central Asian Muslim majority country of Kazakhstan will be the first country to join the Abraham Accords in his second term. This is a little confusing to me, Jacob, and I think to many, because Israel actually has relations with Kazakhstan. So what do both countries gain in this announcement?
Yeah, I think it definitely puzzled quite a few people. I guess the argument that the Trump administration is making as they try to sell this is that, A, we're building momentum for the Abraham Accords that has been really digressing since the Gaza war. But in terms of answering your question more directly, now we are trying to make this Abraham Accords a club of cooperation, the platform of cooperation for Israel and the Arab and Muslim worlds. So now Kazakhstan can be in this broader partnership with Israel and with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and any other country that is interested in joining. But as you mentioned, given the fact that these two countries have had ties since 1992, given that I'm not sure how many opportunities are really necessary for cooperation between Israel, Kazakhstan, and Bahrain, obviously the more the merrier. As much collaboration between Israel and all these countries is better. But I'm not really sure if there's a strategic benefit, at least at that kind of scale, between having Kazakhstan working closely with some of its partners in the Middle East. But obviously, I think it's a broader effort to shore up a presence against Iran. But I think it's noteworthy that it's been about a week since that announcement was made. And we're not even hearing, I think even before today, we haven't really heard the Trump administration trying to make this big celebration of the announcement and kind of bragging about this new victory. Because I think it's hard to sell. I don't think this is the major addition to the Abraham Accords that the Trump administration have been hoping. I think they're realizing that Saudi Arabia is going to be a much heavier lift. So they're hoping that, okay, let's start with Kazakhstan. We'll see where we can build from. But I don't think it's something that they're trying to brag about because they recognize this isn't the major crown jewel that they've been hoping for.
So no ceremony on the South Lawn is what you're saying?
Look, Trump did say there's going to be a signing ceremony, but I don't even think it'll include Netanyahu. My understanding is it's just going to be between the U.S. and Kazakhstan.
All right, we'll see. Jacob, thank you so much, as always, for staying up so late to join me in my very early morning for our daily briefing on Thursday today.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by Ben Wallach. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.